Fox News host Bill O'Reilly's new book, Killing Jesus, is out. What facts about Jesus' life, death, burial, and resurrection does Bill O'Reilly present? Today, you will find out. My guests are Dr. Darrell Bock, one of the leading historical Jesus scholars in the United States, and one of the world's foremost authorities on the Gospel of Luke. He is Senior Research Professor of New Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary. One of the books that Bill O'Reilly recommends that we all read and relied on in his writing is Dr. Bock's book, Studying the Historical Jesus, a guide to sources and methods. My second guest is Dr. Gary Habermas, the distinguished research professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy and Theology at Liberty University. He holds a PhD from Michigan State University and has authored, co-authored, or edited more than 60 books, including one of the key articles in Jesus Under Fire, another book Mr. O'Reilly used and recommends we read. I will ask these two scholars to tell us what they think about Mr. O'Reilly's latest book about Jesus on this special edition of the John Ankerberg Show. Welcome to our program. We got a great one for you today. We're going to be critiquing Bill O'Reilly's new book, Killing Jesus. And we're going to be doing so with two of the leading New Testament scholars in the world. Bill O'Reilly himself recommended that we read their books. And today we're going to start with the main question of Bill O'Reilly's book, why was Jesus crucified? All right? What did Jesus say that the religious leaders accused him of blasphemy and deserving of death? And secondly, what crimes did the Romans accuse Jesus of doing that led Pilate to crucify him? Two different scenes. It's going to take us back into the story, what did Jesus say and do? And my guests are Dr. Darrell Bock, one of the leading historical Jesus scholars in our country and one of the world's foremost authorities on the Gospel of Luke. He's a senior research professor of New Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary. And Dr. Gary Habermas, the distinguished research professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy and Theology at Liberty University, who has authored, co-authored, or edited more than 60 books. Guys, I am glad that you're here. I want to start, Darrell, with first impressions. When you read his book, Bill O'Reilly's book, Killing Jesus, did you pick it up as positive, negative? What strengths and weaknesses did you see in his book?
Well, the book is basically a popularization of the gospel story of Jesus, in which he runs through some issues of background as well as some of the core things that Jesus did and said. And it really reads as a paraphrase of Scripture. It runs through the story in sequence. Every now and then there's an interjection of a key Roman figure who has an important role to play, and so he's juxtaposing those two things. It's reasonably well done. It's not very skeptical, but there is a level of foundation underneath which you don't often expect in a popularization that isn't there, and so the rationale for why he's making the argument that he makes in certain spots is not entirely clear.
Yeah. Dr. Habermas?
Well, I picked the book up and I thought, all right, I'm ready for the shoe to drop, you know, and so I opened it and I'd read and I thought, well, okay, put a question mark or two, but I kept reading. I thought, this isn't bad. I mean, this is pretty fair. So kept reading and then I went to the end of the story because that's where I do most of my research. So I flipped to the end. I thought, this is even better than the early stuff. And I mean, there were little things here and there, but overall I was really pleasantly surprised. And then when I got to that last sources chapter where he lists many of the folks and found many of us and our friends listed there, I thought, wow. I thought, no wonder it was good.
Yeah. Now, the criticism, I think, is going to come in the weeks ahead from other critical scholars. And we want to, in a sense, strengthen O'Reilly's case here. And we want to point out, when you guys are looking at the sources and so on, how the game is played. And Darrell, he pointed to your book specifically about the sources. And, you know, for all these years, over 30 years, you have been examining all the different sources, and you've written huge books. You have had an international group of scholars for 10 years looking at just 12 key facts of Jesus' life. You wrote an 800-page book about those sources. I'm saying, come on. So what I want to know is, explain to my audience, they're not all scholars out here, some of them are, but tell them briefly, what are the rules to the road if you say, okay, we've got the New Testament, and you're not a Christian that just says, I believe this is from God, it's inspired and inerrant. If you're skeptical, you've got sources. How do you grade those sources? How do you know where you're going?
Well, it's really important to understand why we have the rules. We have the rules because some people say you can't trust the sources. You can't just simply open the Bible and believe what's there. So how do you make a case for believing what's there? It's the old journalist rule of I don't print a story unless I have two witnesses. And so one of the criteria, one of the rules, it's all about corroboration, and one of the rules is the idea of multiple attestation. How many different source levels that feed into the Gospels contribute to this theme or story? And the wider the spread, the more multiple the attestation, then the larger the case for the credibility that this actually did happen. And so the sources as they work are Mark and Q are the two most important ones. Mark is generally regarded as being the first gospel written. And Q is a combination of Matthew and Luke. About 200 verses in Matthew and Luke are shared that aren't in Mark and that deal primarily with Jesus' teaching.
Okay, when you talk about the sources, most people that are Christians look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then you got Paul's letters. So those are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sources.
Right.
Right? Now, you're saying that beyond that, when you read, say, for example, Luke chapter 1,
right.
Luke says right in the preface, before he got there, many others had written bits and pieces about Jesus' life, and he gathered that up. Mm-hmm. Those were sources. We don't have them at hand right now, but apparently he did. And some of them, he checked them out and found out these were eyewitness sources and they were good stuff. And you're saying there's something like that with this Q.
Yeah, Q is either an oral or a written tradition. That gets discussed. It's the material that Matthew and Luke share. It comprises about 200 verses of each of those Gospels. Matthew and Luke are said not to have used one another. The moment you do that, you've got to deal with where this came from. And so Q stands for the German word Quelle, which means source. And remember that the Gospels originally, there weren't written Gospels. They were telling stories about Jesus. These were being passed on orally because we're in an oral culture. And so this source base is one of the things that the Gospel writers drew upon. It was the church source base about the stories of Jesus. And that's what Q is. So Mark is one of the sources. Q is one of the sources. And then traditionally, the unique material in Luke is a source. The unique material in Matthew is seen as a source. And the unique material in John is seen as a source. And then there are others that can be spread beyond that. But those are the core ones. So that's multiple attestation. A variation of that is called attestation of forms. That's the different literary genres that something can appear in. That's like a cross-check, if you will. So that's the second standard. The third one is called dissimilarity. If it's not like Judaism, and it's not like the early church, it must be Jesus. Now that one is a tough sieve to get through because a lot of what Jesus does connect either to the past or leads into the future. And some people have done a variation on it called double dissimilarity. Not quite like Judaism and not quite like the early church. And if you can show that it's in the movement between those two, then that can count too. That's another standard. The fourth rule is embarrassment. The early church wouldn't write something like this. They wouldn't castigate one of their leaders and put them in this frame and show them in this way unless it really happened that way. And then the last one is the criterion of rejection. We have to be able to know how the event leads to the ultimate rejection of Jesus. So those are 5 of the rules. They're not all of them, but those are 5 of the rules that we play the game by, all designed to corroborate or verify the claim that this particular theme or event or saying happened.
Gary, how do you give weight to, how many of the sources do you have to have for it to be considered good evidence? 1 source, 2 source, 3 source, 4? Where do you as scholars say, I think we got something here that we can rely on?
Well, just like in a court of law, there's no rule on what you have, how many you have to have, because I think you want to, Darrell mentioned different kinds of attestation. You have to kind of weigh the kind of attestation. You've got the rules. You've also got the specific subcategories within each one. What kind of attestation? Are the two kinds of attestation you have both late, or are they both early? Do you have, if you have Mark and Q, now you're or if you have a secular source for something, those count with folks. But so you have to kind of pull those apart and look at them. But the Jesus Seminar says that if you have two sources, independent sources for a saying of Jesus, that increases the likelihood. Well, if two might do the job, what do you do with the Bart Ehrman, who's probably the best-known skeptic in this country? What do you do when he says he's got about a dozen sources for the crucifixion of Jesus? I think if two is pretty good, we know a dozen is overkill, and that's why the crucifixion of Jesus is so well accepted.
And you've got to appreciate the fact here that these criteria are discussed and debated. This isn't a science where everything lands, and it's clear. This is why it gets discussed, is because you're weighing evidence, and that's what a historian always does.
And our position here is if you weigh this evidence, we can support what is said in the New Testament Gospels.
That's right. That their core credibility can be defended, and it can be defended on a basis that says more than simply, well, it's true because it's in the Bible. Here's why it's true. Here's why anyone looking at this should take it seriously that these things happen.
Talk about your brother.
Yeah, the book that I did, Who is Jesus, was written in part because my brother, who was trained in the Ivy League as a lawyer, was skeptical about religion. And so we engaged a discussion on Jesus, and I couldn't just cite the Bible to cite the Bible. As a lawyer, he would sit there and he would say, well, let's put you in the docket and take a look at this. And he would bring good questions. And so we engaged in this conversation over a long period of time, discussing the evidence using these kinds of rules as a way of drawing him in to think about what was in the Scripture. And this, along with just the credible testimony of people's lives, etc., eventually opened him up to being responsive to the gospel.
All right. Folks, we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back, and we're going to talk about, okay, how is this evidence applied to the question, why was Jesus crucified? How did O'Reilly handle it? How would you guys advise him to strengthen his case? We'll talk about that when we come right back. All right, we're back, and we're asking the question, why was Jesus crucified? It's the main topic of Bill O'Reilly's book, and we're talking with Dr. Darrell Bock and Dr. Gary Habermas. And Darrell, O'Reilly says on page 232 that Jesus is standing there, and the high priest Caiaphas fumes at him. I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Tell us how that is answered in Mark 14.
Well, basically, Jesus claims that God is going to vindicate him and take him to the right hand of God. And so what that means is that he's basically saying, you can do with me whatever you want. You can deliver me over to the Romans. You can have me crucified. But this story's not done. One day that tomb is going to be empty. And when that tomb is empty, you can know that I am seated in heaven with the only God. And that raises the question, who can sit with God in heaven? It's a good question. Not just be present with him, but actually sit with him, share his rules, share his authority. That's what Jesus is claiming. So in effect, what he's saying is, you can crucify me, you can kill me, but if you do that, when that tomb goes empty, you can find my address, and it's www.righthandofgod.com. And in the midst of doing that, this indicates who I am. So he's not only making a statement about who he is, he's making a prediction about what God's going to do, and it's a claim of vindication that really supports everything about his life and ministry. That's the blasphemy charge. But from blasphemy, he can't go to Pilate. The Jews can't take Jesus to Pilate and say he's committed blasphemy. Pilate would go, I don't care. They've got to translate that charge. That charge gets translated into claiming to be a king. Claiming to be a king that Rome didn't appoint. Now, the Romans believe in law and order. You believe our law, or we'll put you in order. And the one thing they don't like is someone claiming to be a king who they didn't appoint. They have a means of disposing with such people. It's called crucifixion. You crucify someone for sedition. So Jesus was crucified for sedition, which was the translation of the religious charge before the Jews that he blasphemed.
Gary, those words, a lot of people don't catch the impact of those words. Are you the Christ, the Messiah? the Son of the Blessed One. Out of respect, the Jews wouldn't put God's name there. So, are you the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God? And Jesus says, I am. And then he says, you will see the Son of Man coming.
Right.
What are those three titles all about?
Well, it's amazing because they ask him a Messiah, Son of God question, to which he answers affirmatively. Then he translates, if we call it translation, to a Son of Man comment. And we lose so much between the New Testament sense and the English sense. You might think, all right, the most blasphemous thing there must be Son of God, and Jesus says yes. But Son of God doesn't have to mean divine. Messiah does not have to mean divine, and in the Talmud is not a blasphemy charge. So you wonder what he's doing. Then he says Son of Man. And what if someone said, what if the high priest had said, look, you're the Son of Man. I'm the Son of Man. We're all sons of man. Can we get back to the Son of God thing? No, when he says the Son of Man, and then the details about it, coming on the clouds and seated in the right hand of God, he gets the formal charge of blasphemy. So something there, or a combination, sets off the high priest. And it seems, there is a combination. Yes to Son, yes to Messiah. Coming on the clouds, which was only a prerogative of God in the Old Testament, coming in the clouds, and was coming in judgment in the Old Testament. All of that. But it seems like seated on the right hand of God is what really pulled the string. So the emphasis is something a little different than we have in the church today, where we think it's probably Son of God, maybe Messiah. No, it's right hand of God, because now you're claiming to have God's prerogatives and being able to rule with him, and that precipitates the formal charge, not the no, you didn't answer my question. No, he answered it. He answered it a few times over here. So it's a very insightful scene.
What's really important about Gary's answer is that we tend to think that what makes Jesus important are the titles that he used. But actually, it's what he portrays himself as doing that's more important. So whether I've got Son of Man or Christ or Messiah, what really does it is being seated at the right hand of God. The idea that I can park next to the eternal God and work with him in his program. No one shares that throne. It's God's unique glory that we're talking about. So the flip side of it is, if that's who he is and that's what he's doing, who is able to sit with the unique God and share his glory? What must that mean about the person who sits with him? And it's that action that does it. And the audience, Jesus' audience, Caiaphas gets it. Caiaphas is a good theologian. And so he rips his clothes, not because he doesn't get what Jesus is saying, because he gets it, he doesn't believe it. And if Jesus is not who he claims to be, that's blasphemy.
This title, Son of Man, people don't realize Jesus used that 82 times in the four Gospels. And he's basically the only one that uses it, and he defines the term. How does he use that term? What does the Son of Man do?
Well, it's an ambiguous term because the core term simply means son of a human being. So it's like David's son, Charlie's son, whatever. But in the certain context of Daniel, it's the Son of Man, one like the Son of Man, who comes to the Ancient of Days. And he rides clouds. Now, as Gary mentioned, this is something only transcendents do. In the Old Testament, it's either God or the gods who ride the clouds. So I've got a human being doing divine kind of stuff. And he comes to the Ancient of Days to receive authority. That's what Jesus is alluding to, is that imagery. That imagery existed in Judaism. First Enoch, the similitudes, talked about a glorified Son of Man sitting next to God, so much so that Judaism talked about two powers in heaven. So he's working in familiar territory, and he is claiming, making an incredible claim by the actions that he is describing, and Caiaphas gets it.
Gary, in terms of the mission of Jesus, let's talk about that briefly here. The Son of Man has come to seek and to save those which were lost.
Right.
The Son of Man, Jesus said, has come to give his life as a ransom for many. The Son of Man, he said, like in judgment, is going to come with the holy angels, and he's going to gather all the nations before him, and he's going to separate them like a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. This Son of Man, according to Jesus, is a pretty powerful person, but this fact that he came to give his life a ransom for many.
Yeah, and that didn't fit with the eschatology or the theology of most of the Jews at that time. Even if you were a Messiah-type figure, generally speaking, it's not thought you were going to die. And so when Jesus starts talking death, that's one thing. When he mentions resurrection, that's another one. He was just, to them, I think he was very complicated. He said a lot of things the disciples messed up on. So, but I think overall, I think Son of Man is a real key figure, because it can mean, like Darrell said, it can mean, it's used in the Old Testament of a regular man. It's used of a prophet, almost 100 times, the book of Ezekiel, prophesy, O Son of Man. But Jesus, we know what he means, because twice he paraphrases the words of Daniel, and in Daniel 7, we get that sense of this pre-existent divine figure who comes from the Ancient of Days, and that's pretty lofty.
Yeah. Last thoughts about how O'Reilly handles the scene of Jesus before Pilate or Jesus before the high priest.
He just describes it. He describes it simply as the Bible presents it, and we're left with that. The background point is that a skeptic would come and say, how do we even know what was said at the trial? There was no one there but Jesus. Of course, they don't think Jesus is raised. So how does that leak out? And the key point to realize here is there are lots of potential witnesses. Nicodemus would have known what was going on. Paul, who knew what was going on, the upper echelons of Judaism knew what was going on. There are lots of ways for this information to leak out.
Yeah, didn't even some of the secular scholars and Jewish scholars in their writings say that the Jewish leaders brought him, and they would have kept track of what was going on and even had their own records about it, wouldn't they?
Well, we do have some records. In the Talmud, we have a reference to Jesus being convicted of sorcery. And in the context, we think of sorcery as someone who plays around with the occult or something. But sorcery also means a teacher that leads people astray. And so Jesus was definitely, just like the Gospels say, they went after him for being a false teacher of sorts.
All right. Next week, we're going to turn the corner on this, and we're going to look at another one of the key questions in Bill O'Reilly's book, and that is, did Jesus, while he was living, did he actually claim to be the unique Son of God in the fullest sense that we think about that? All right? And we're going to talk about that next week, and I hope that you'll join us. Welcome to our program. We got a great one for you today. We're talking about Bill O'Reilly's new book, Killing Jesus. What do you think about it? We've got two of the leading New Testament scholars in the world here today that are going to talk about this topic, and Bill O'Reilly himself recommends that we should read their books. And so we're going to listen to the folks that he thinks are his advisors, and the question we're going to look at is, do scholars think that when Jesus lived, he himself claimed to be the unique Son of God? Bill O'Reilly says straight out, yes. He says, Jesus claimed to be the Son of God from the time he was 12. Claimed to be the promised Messiah. Also the Son of Man who will sit at the right hand of God and come riding in the clouds of glory, who will judge the whole world. All right? What do you make of these statements?
Well, the statements are important. They also are actually few and far between in the Gospels. They just appear here and there like little cameo appearances. Far more important in understanding who Jesus is are the types of things that Jesus does in the midst of some of the things that he says. So there are a wide variety of things. For example, he claims authority over the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a day that God is responsible for. He claims the right to forgive sins. We're going to come back to this because this is a very important claim. He claims the idea of being able to cleanse the temple. He works with holy space. He claims to be able and shows that he can calm the wind and the waves, so much so that the disciples at the end can say, who can command the winds and the waves, and they obey him. It's a good question.
And I like that passage because if we had been standing there in the boat, when the waves are coming in, I see Hawaii 5-0, I see those waves coming in, and the guys are saying, where's Jesus? He's sacked out at the back here, and they say, we're going down. Tell him to grab a bucket.
Yeah, don't you care?
Yeah. But what he does after he says, peace, be still. Peter says, hey, come on, forget that. Let's get a bucket. Mm-hmm. But when it happens, and when the wind stops, and when the waves start calming down, and they lick up against the boat, if we had been standing there in the boat with those guys and had seen that, I think we would have said the same thing that's recorded about those guys. Peter, or whoever said it, says, who is this guy?
Yeah, and I think that as it happened afterwards, they probably would have said, that was pretty impressive. So you've got this array of things that Jesus is doing, and his actions really show who he is. When John the Baptist asks, "Are you the one to come, or should we expect another?" And I'd say John the Baptist didn't watch enough television. If he had asked that question properly, he would have said, "Are you the one to come, or should we expect another? Yes or no? Will you help me out here by giving me a simple answer?" Instead, Jesus uses the open-ended answer, and he says, "Go and tell John what you see and hear." And so, lepers are cleansed, and the lame walk, the blind see. We're getting miracles that we don't even get in the Old Testament. We're using passages out of Isaiah that says, when the time of salvation comes, this is what I'm going to be doing. And so Jesus is the one who does them. And so what he shows tells you who he is.
Let's take another one, and that is this story in an early account, Mark, which all the scholars say is probably the first one that was written. So you have an early account, and in that early account, in chapter 2, we find one of these stories, one of these actions of Jesus. He comes to Capernaum, comes into a house, he starts to teach, the religious leaders are there, the place is jammed out, 4 guys come bringing a paralytic on a bed. They get there, all the tickets are sold out.
Yeah,
they
can't
get
no way
in.
we're getting in here.
Yeah.
So just imagine it. This is one of the most visual events, I think, in the Scripture, and so we've got to visualize what's going on. You're sitting in there listening to Jesus. The next thing you hear, whoompa, whoompa, whoompa. The next thing you see are snowflakes, only it's snowflakes of dirt coming down on your head. The next thing that you see is the paralytic being lowered down. Plunk. Now, I know there weren't hydraulic lifts in the first century, but ropes don't make sound, so give me a break. I want you to visualize this. And he's sitting there in front of Jesus. He's come to be healed, and Jesus says to him, "Your sins are forgiven." Now, this is not in the text, but it's important. If you're the paralytic sitting there in front of Jesus, and Jesus says, "Your sins are forgiven," what are you thinking? Well, you're sitting there saying, "That's not why I crashed this party." But then Jesus is trying to make a point, because you cannot see sins being forgiven. I don't care how you think about it. I can't show you that sins have been forgiven. I mean, just imagine that. "Oh, bye, sin. Hope you had a good time. Hope you stay away a very long time. Hope I never see you again." You don't see it. But you can see a paralytic walk and be healed. And so Jesus says, what's easier, to say your sins are forgiven, or to say, take up your mat and walk? And so he shows something that you cannot see by something that you can see. When he says, take up that mat and walk, it's showtime. He's got to deliver. And so when that paralytic gets up and walks, his walk talks, because the text says, in order that you might know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, I say to you, take up your mat and walk. And as he walks, his walk talks and says, the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Meanwhile, the theologians are thinking, no one can forgive sins but God alone. But then they've got the problem, then how did that guy walk? If God doesn't help someone who's a sinner and who false teaches, then how did that guy get healed? And how could the linking that Jesus made between sin and healing have taken place? And that's the dilemma that Mark 2's action shows you. And that's why sometimes Jesus' actions spoke far louder than his words.
All right, but let's step back, Darrell, and let's say the critic says to you, that's a neat story, and yeah, that's what Jesus is saying, but I don't believe that he actually healed this guy that was paralyzed.
Now, the best we can do is to talk about the nature of Jesus' miracles and the reputation that he developed. And for this, we have unique attestation outside the Bible. Josephus says that Jesus did works, unusual works. The Greek word is paradoxon. It means unusual works or wonderful works, depending on how positive you want to translate it. And so there's a reputation that Jesus did miracles outside the biblical materials. Not only that, the Jewish materials also come along and say he was a magician or a sorcerer. Now note what that concedes. Jesus did unusual things. We're just going to debate the power that generated it. So in either case, we've got outside testimony that Jesus did unusual things. And this is one of the unusual things that he did. And we know they were upset with the kinds of claims that he made. That's why they eventually brought him to trial. So all those things come together to make the case that something like the healing of the paralytic is the kind of event that Jesus would have done.
What would you add to that, Gary, about this fact that we've got these miracle claims in here, something really happened? How do you persuade people that are skeptical about the miraculous that something really did happen?
Earlier, we introduced the so-called criteria in the New Testament. Here's some signs: multiple attestation, multiple form, dissimilarity, embarrassment, enemy attestation, and so on. By the way, this is enemy attestation, because if the critics standing right there say, wow, this guy really is doing something, exorcising demons and healing, and they say, well, you're just doing this by the power of Satan, they've already conceded that he's really doing it. But when you apply those same rules to the miracle passages in major studies like John Meyer's Marginal Jew, Volume 2, and Graham Twelvetree's Jesus the Miracle Worker, both spend almost 500 pages going through the approximately 30 miracle pericopes, accounts there, and they both decide that in a fair number of cases, Graham Twelvetree's is in the 70s percentile. In a fair number of these cases, there is good evidence using these criteria for each. Now, just give one example. Critics, when they look at the Gospels, they often see 5 sources. To be real simple, Mark, the special material in Luke, special material in Matthew, Q, and John. Miracles are attested in 5 out of 5. By the way, we've already discussed Son of Man. Son of Man is attested in 5 out of 5. When the Jesus Seminar is asking for two independent sources, and you only have 5 out of 5 for miracles. You only have 5 out of 5 for Son of Man. Now it's more apparent why people have a hard time hiding from this stuff. We have to let the text speak for itself.
And I would say, Daryl, there's a shift in critical scholarship that Jesus is considered to be a miracle worker in the sense of exorcisms, of healings, and probably the place where they hold up is on the nature miracles, right?
That's right.
How do you put that together?
Well, again, once we start walking down this road, the question is, how far are you going to walk? And so once you establish that Jesus did miracles and he does unusual things, he certainly had that reputation. Everyone who writes on historical Jesus, except for the people who think that Jesus never existed, which is really out here on a fringe, everyone else says he has a reputation as a miracle worker. And then everyone has explanations for how they think that works, depending on how they apply the criteria in some cases, or what their worldview will permit. And so that really is what impacts the judgments that are made in this area.
And you're saying, which we're going to get to, your area, that is that the biggest nature miracle...
Exactly. John Dominic Crossan, a very well-known skeptic, says that the biggest miracle of all is the resurrection. And so if you can get to a nature miracle like Jesus returned from the dead, why do we have... If the resurrection happened, why do we have a problem with a storm stopping? Now, a storm is wonderful. Calming a storm at your word is great. Rising from the dead when you're dead as dead can be, that's why we spend a lot of time on resurrection. So yes, that's the top one of Jesus' miracles if you want to judge in terms of how odd this is and how good the evidence is.
Let me just say something about these two guys that are here. Dr. Habermas is tracking 3,400 different scholars in what they say about the resurrection. When I heard this, I said, Gary, you got to get a life. 3,400 different guys. He's tracking what they say. So when he's giving these statistics, he's reading them, he's listening to them, and he can give you an accurate idea of what the critical world is saying about this. And Daryl is working with so many guys, it's unbelievable. Now, when we come back, we're going to talk further about, did Jesus actually say himself that he was the unique Son of God? How can we tell from the sources that Jesus actually said those words, okay? Because there's a lot of discussion about this. O'Reilly's got it in his book. We'll talk about it when we come right back. We're back. We're talking with Dr. Daryl Bach and with Dr. Gary Habermas, and our topic is, did Jesus actually say that he was the unique Son of God? How can we know that he said the words, all right? And Dr. Habermas, we've got 3 verses at least that scholars say Jesus had to have said these words, and I want you to tell us why. I'm going to put them on the screen first of all, and then the first one is Matthew 11:27. Jesus says, "All things have been handed over to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son wishes to reveal him. Now, why does that verse stand out with the scholars?
It stands out with the scholars because this is one of those texts that we identified earlier as a Q text. So Q stands along with Mark and scholarly research as the two earliest sources for the Gospels. And Matthew's mentioning a very high Christology here. There's been a lot of comparison of Matthew and Luke to John at this point, and it's called Johannine Thunderbolt. It's like the moment of inspiration that comes from God, because Jesus claims to be the only bridge. We say, Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And we go, well, that's John, and scholars don't really like John. But here's something very similar in Matthew, where the Q passage is saying, no one knows the Father but the Son, and whomever I choose to reveal him. So you're only going to know the Father from the Son. So there's another one of those unique, only begotten, monogenes kind of in the Greek, kind of this sense of unique, one of a kind. But because it's Q, and because it's not in John, it gets a lot of attention.
Second one is Mark 14:36. Jesus said, Abba, Father, all things are possible to you. Take this cup away from me, but not what I will, but what you will. What's the significance of Abba, Father to the scholars?
Well, it's usually believed that Jesus spoke in Aramaic, but the Gospels are written in Greek. So one of the criteria that are often mentioned, Darrell said there's other type of criteria. One of them is Aramaic substrata. So when the Aramaic breaks through, so to speak, that's probably the closest we get to hearing the exact words of Jesus. And what's interesting is we hear the exact words of Jesus, or something like, very close, at very, very important times. When he raises the little girl from the dead, when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? But here, he's calling God a very familiar term for somebody that you know intimately, which, by the way, goes along with the text we just mentioned, Matthew 11:27. Jesus is claiming intimate knowledge once again, and his title is sort of like when everybody else is talking about the boss of the company or the president of the university by these lofty figures, and you call him Fred, and you call him that to his face, so everybody knows you're really awesome, That's what Jesus is doing here. So it's the Aramaic substrata here that gives it away.
What does Abba actually mean?
Well, there used to be a lot of argument about this, that the word means daddy, so much so that one recent New Testament scholar who objected wrote a journal article called Abba Does Not Mean Daddy. So I try not to say it's daddy, but I mean, what's the difference? It's a familial, in-house, personal term for somebody you know very well on intimate grounds, and you may call them that to their face, and they're not going to object.
Would the Jews use that term about God?
Virtually never.
Never. Third one, Mark 13:32. Very interesting. Jesus says, but of that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone.
This is another one of the criteria. So we're going right down the line. We're checking off the criteria in these programs. This is the criterion of embarrassment. If you're going to say you're the Son of God, then just say you're the Son of God. Why say I'm the Son? Now, in context, he's Son of the Father. But why say I'm the Son of God? Oh, and by the way, I don't know when something's going to happen. Go, what? How is that? I mean, you're the Son of God or you're not. How do you not? But Jesus walked right in there, had no problem saying it. And so the thought is, as one British scholar says, that is so embarrassing for Jesus to say, I'm the Son of God, but I don't know something. He said the church could figure out ways to do a much better job of saying I'm the Son of God than to say I'm the Son of God and let me mess up your world a little bit by saying I'm telling you I don't know something. So that kind of embarrassment, trying to figure that out, indicates that Jesus really did say that.
Hi. Is one of the thunderbolts you were talking about in John that scholars reject because it's a single source is Jesus is talking with the religious leaders in John 8:58 and says, before Abraham was born, I'm the I am, boys. And they reach for the rocks to kill him. Because he's saying, hey, the one who was speaking to Moses at the burning bush, and he said, this is my name for all generations, my memorial name for forever, is the I am. And Jesus said, that's me. Is that one of the thunderbolts? How would you put John into these texts?
Well, the trouble with using John simply is that most of what is said in John is not corroborated, and this is a corroborative standard. 88% of John isn't anywhere else, so you lose most of the Gospel of John in these conversations. And that's one of the things that people don't appreciate about the historical Jesus discussion, because the church loves to run to John. John does all our heavy lifting for us. It tells the story of Jesus from heaven down. Jesus is God from the very first verse. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is CNN, the Christian News Network. And so you've got this emphasis right at the start. The Synoptic Gospels tell the story of Jesus from earth up. They start with categories that we're used to, and it dawns on people who Jesus is. And the church, generally speaking, struggles with that a little more. And so we have a harder time going there. And yet, if the church can get a handle on how to tell that story, they do a better job of communicating who Jesus is to people who are asking who Jesus is because they don't understand who he is.
You did 10 years of study on this one passage, Caesarea Philippi. Talk about it.
Well, the main thing here is that if you look at the parallels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what they all share is the confession that Jesus is the Messiah. And it's in contrast to the idea that the populace thinks he's a prophet. Prophets are a dime a dozen, but there's only one Messiah. And so off the confession that Peter makes that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God can just mean Messiah. Off that confession, Jesus builds the kind of Messiah that he's going to be, that he's going to suffer, that he's going to be exalted and taken to the right hand of God. So the core point of Caesarea Philippi really is the idea that if we look at Luke and at Mark and just read them, you are the Christ of God. Those are the answers in those two Gospels. In contrast to Matthew that says, you are the Christ, the Son of God. And so what we do in the church is we run to Son of God and say, oh, see, Peter's confessing everything. But if you take Luke and Mark on their own, all that he confesses is that he's the Christ. That's the point. And off of that, he builds the picture of who he is. Now, eventually, he associates Messiah and Son of God as Son of God. But he builds his way there because the Gospels tell the story of Jesus from the earth up.
What this conversation is doing is telling you how critical scholars should build a case. Bill O'Reilly didn't necessarily build the case with this kind of evidence. He just made the statement. He's probably going to need your evidence coming up, okay? But you're saying that the evidence, when he gets there, is going to support a lot of the stuff he said about Jesus' claim to be the Son of God and the Messiah.
Well, I think what you're seeing is that when he appeals to sources at the end of his book, he says, I'm only giving you the core storyline. Here's the core storyline of where this is going. This is what got Jesus into trouble. This is why they killed Jesus, etc. Here are the core things that happen. But if you want to know what happens when you get into a discussion and people doubt some of what that story is, then there's this whole other layer of conversation that needs to come into the equation, and that's what we hope to supply.
All right. Next week we're going to continue this. We're going to look at another one of the big concepts in Bill O'Reilly's book. He says Jesus flat out claimed to be the Messiah. What does the word Messiah mean, and why was that a word that was so dangerous in Jesus' day? Hope that you'll join us next week. Welcome to our program. We're talking about the very controversial Bill O'Reilly's book, Killing Jesus. All right? I'm sure that you've heard about it, and we're talking with two of the leading New Testament scholars in the world, both of whom Bill O'Reilly recommends that we read their books. And today we're going to talk about the topic in Bill O'Reilly's books, one of them, does the historical evidence show that Jesus claimed that he was the Messiah of God? And what does the word Messiah mean? Now, Bill O'Reilly is very clear in saying, yeah, Jesus said that he was the Messiah over and over again and was one of the reasons he got killed. We're going to talk about why was the word Messiah a dangerous word, all right? Now, my guests are Dr. Darrell Bock, one of the leading historical Jesus scholars in our country, one of the world's foremost authorities on the Gospel of Luke, and he is Senior Research Professor of New Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary. And then Dr. Gary Habermas, the Distinguished Research Professor and Chair of the Department of Philosophy and Theology at Liberty University, who has authored, co-authored, or edited more than 60 books. Darrell, I want to start with you. And take me back to the fact of how do historians today look at this claim that Jesus said that he was the Messiah. First of all, is there evidence that Jesus said that?
Well, the key evidence that we have that Jesus made messianic claims actually is tied to the cross. The titulus that went over the cross that established the charge of why Jesus was executed for sedition says, King of the Jews. So we know he wasn't crucified merely for claiming to be a prophet, at least as far as Rome was concerned. Now the question is, did Jesus actually take things in this direction? Well, the way Jesus did this more often had to do with the period that he associated himself with and then the actions that he performed to show salvation than him going around saying, I am Messiah, I am pretty. He actually made those public claims very, very rarely because of the ambiguity of the term Messiah itself. Messiah means anointed one, but the expectation was the Messiah would either be a transcendent figure who would come from beyond, the Messiah would be a military ruler who would crush the Gentile nations, or if you were at Qumran, the Messiah was one of two Messiahs along with a priestly Messiah who would bring the end. Those were the dominant portraits, and none of them had suffering in them. So Jesus didn't use the term all that widely because of the misunderstanding that it would introduce. He saved the introduction of the term, generally speaking, for the last part of his ministry when he was pressing things. In the meantime, he showed who he was, and by showing who he was indicating what he was about.
Bill O'Reilly has a long passage about John the Baptist, his meeting with Jesus, and then later John being thrown in jail. And he starts doubting what he had said about Jesus, that he was the Messiah, the Lamb of God that would take away the sin of the world. All of this, he seems to have doubted. Talk about what the question was that John asked his disciples to go and ask Jesus, and the significance, unscramble the answer that Jesus gave back to him. Would it have made sense to John?
Yeah, when John is doubting, he sends messengers to ask Jesus, are you the one to come or should we expect another? I suspect John being in jail, the fact that you don't have the evidence of a powerful Messiah who's going to wipe out the nations, Jesus isn't building any armies or anything like this, all raise questions in John's mind. And so he asks him, are you the one to come and should we expect another? Well, interestingly, Jesus doesn't answer by saying, yes, I'm the Messiah, you can write it on the dotted line. No, what he does is says, go tell John what you see and hear. And he goes through a list of events that lepers are cleansed, that the blind see, that the deaf can hear, that the good news is preached to the poor, those kinds of things. Almost all those statements come out of sections of the book of Isaiah where we're talking about what the end time period is, what God's going to do when he delivers in what's called the eschaton, the last period when the final deliverance is coming. So these are end time period events. Now we tend to think about the end time as future in relationship to us, but what Jesus is saying is, no, the end time is associated with me and my coming. In fact, what he did in portraying who he was to place himself in the midst of this period. And he's saying, you can know who I am by the types of things that I'm doing. I'm doing the stuff that comes with end-time deliverance. And end-time deliverance comes not only with these events, but with the figure who brings them. That makes me the Messiah. That's the long form of the answer in which he could have simply said, yes.
Gary, we're going to talk about, do historians and critical scholars believe that Jesus actually did and performed supernatural miracles? We're going to do that next week. Right here, though, Jesus says to John, the blind see, the lame are healed, guys that have leprosy. He goes down this list that are all miracles. Isn't this evidence in itself that they must have been going on? Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, they do walk away. They don't stay there and go, and Jesus also lists raising the dead there. By the way, this is Q, quote unquote. So,
and what is Q for people?
Q, again, is the material that Matthew and Luke uses that's not found in Mark. So it's one of, I guess we could presume to say, one of the sources that Luke tells us he had knowledge of in Luke 1:1-4. So it's early, and Jesus is a miracle worker. So until the end of Jesus' life, the predicted death and resurrection, the final scene, the miracles and the exorcisms were you could argue, the chief events that would point to his words being true. Darrell earlier said, let's just not look at his teachings, let's look at his actions. Miracles and exorcisms would have to be right up there I would say, first in line as far as his actions that point to him being somebody special. Now, you could say, well, there's a few other people who claim to have done these things too. Well, first of all, the sources aren't anything like the sources, as close to and so on as in the New Testament. And secondly, that's not the end of the act. That's not all there is. There's more coming for Jesus.
Yeah, and for people that are skeptics, one of the reasons you accept this is, first of all, you've got early source Q before Matthew and Luke, or before Mark and Luke, and you've got the fact of outside attestation in terms of religious and secular writers that saying Jesus was, well, you say it.
Well, basically what you have is you do have your early sources. You know, Mark and Q are your earliest sources. And so you've got early sources. You've got outside sources that say Jesus was a magician or Jesus was a sorcerer. We're talking about in the mid-2nd century with Justin Martyr in his debate with the Jew Trypho. Magician comes up, and the idea of a sorcerer comes up in the Talmud and the official rabbinic Jewish material. So these are outside sources, and although it seems harsh, I mean, it's obviously rejection of Jesus to call a magician and a sorcerer. What it concedes is also very, very important. There's something going on that needs explanation. And so the one category you don't get is the category critics often raise, and that is, didn't happen. No, that's not the way the opponents are dealing with it. The opponents are saying, yeah, it happened, and we've got to explain it's coming from somewhere. We don't think it's coming from a positive source, so we're going to attribute a negative source to it. And so that's why the miraculous is so important. And of course, what the miraculous is pointing to, Jesus didn't heal just to heal. He healed in order to point to what it was about. In fact, I like to call the miracles PowerPoints. He's making points about his power. He's making points about his authority. And he's also pointing to what that power points to. So he can cleanse, he can make people hear, he can make people see. And it isn't just physical hearing and physical seeing. He can make it so people get reconnected to the living God.
In fact, the word miracle, sign, that particular phrase, there's a number of New Testament terms, but sign means pointer. So miracle doesn't stand by itself. It points to something beyond itself. And I think the Mark 2 passage that we talked about earlier is one of the clearest signs of this. So that you may know that the teaching is true, and it's a very bombastic one at that, your sins are forgiven. Wow, only God can do that. Stay tuned. Now I'll heal.
And that comes in a context, that Mark 2 comes in a context in which Jesus has tried to dampen the enthusiasm about miracles, because he knows if he makes miracles the story, people will come to him for healing, and he's about much more than that. So the paralytic event actually is a pointer to say, look, I'm not just about healing. Paralytic drops down in front of him. He doesn't say, I'm going to heal you. He says, your sins are forgiven, because his ministry is about the kingdom of God, and it's about sin. It's not just about healing people.
Yeah, I like the fact that you got Jesus actually saying it, and he's talking about the miracles that he's doing, and the disciples going back to John accept it, so he must have been doing them. You've got the religious leaders accusing him of doing supernatural things just by Satan's power. You've got outside sources that are saying, yeah, he was known for this. You've got early texts. I mean, you've got the whole ball of wax here in terms of answering this question, which is why you think it's pretty solid evidence.
That's right.
Early alone is special, because there are no miracle workers reported within a generation of whom we have sources saying they were miracle workers. The best examples are late. It's a long time later.
And we're going to get into that in the next program, but we're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to take two more things concerning Messiah. What he said at Caesarea Philippi, where he actually seems to ask the guys, who do people say that I am? And Peter says, yeah, you're the Christ, okay? And you're the Messiah. And I also want to talk about Jesus, how he answered the question when the Jewish leaders at the end of his life put him on trial there, what they said about him, or what he told them in terms of what they asked and what his answer was. So we'll talk about this in the context of Messiah, and we're talking about what else could we advise Bill O'Reilly to use in substantiating his case that Jesus did claim that he was the Messiah. Stay tuned. We'll be back for some more in just a moment. All right, we're back. What did you think about Bill O'Reilly's book, Killing Jesus? Have you read it yet? Those of you that have, did you notice what he said about the Messiah? He loads up that term so that the Messiah is this powerful figure who is going to come at the end of time, is going to gather the nations, the whole 9 yards, the most powerful thing that you could say about the Messiah. That's part of his definition, and he's saying Jesus claimed to be that. Now, I'd like to have two of the leading scholars in the world here, Dr. Darrell Bach and Dr. Gary Habermas, that O'Reilly has recommended that we read their books, talk about this word Messiah and give us a little bit more of the context of what he's saying. What does the word mean, and how did Jesus use it? How does critical scholars know that Jesus even claimed to be the Messiah, whatever that was? And two examples. One is what he said at Caesarea Philippi. And again, I'm coming back because you studied this for 10 years with a group of international scholars, okay? And then I want you, in terms of when Jesus is put on trial, or you've got this kind of hearing about what are the charges that the Jewish leaders could bring against Jesus that they would then bring to Pilate, what Jesus told them about being the Christ. We want to talk about both those things. So first, let's start with Caesarea Philippi. Jesus seems to bait the guys, the disciples, by saying, "Who do men say that I am?" All right, and then take it from there.
Yeah, well, the confession takes place in the region of Caesarea Philippi. If you go to Israel today and you look at the sheer rock, you'll see little niches cut out. This is actually one of the most Greco-Roman locations in Israel. We've got temples to the variety of gods here. So the association with Caesarea Philippi as the place where this confession takes place is important. Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do people say I am or the Son of Man is?" You get variation in the wording because Jesus is the Son of Man. And the initial reply is, well, one of the prophets, Jeremiah, etc. Jesus, the populace thinks you're one of the prophets. Now, prophets are a dime a dozen. There are many different prophets. There's been prophets all through time. But we're into the eschaton now. We're into the time when God's going to deliver. So Jesus asks, well, who do you say that I am? And the answer in three different Gospels goes this way. In Matthew, it's, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then in Mark, it's, you are the Christ. And in Luke, it's the Christ of God. Now, if you strip that away and you say, what do all three versions share as the core answer? The answer is the Christ. What's interesting is that Jesus then goes on, and he doesn't talk about the Christ, he goes on to talk about the Son of Man, that the Son of Man is going to suffer. And the importance of the confession is that the disciples recognize that Jesus is the Messiah. There's only one Messiah. There's one eschaton. There's one time to deliver. There's one Messiah. Many prophets, one Messiah. But that Messiah is going to be different than what they expect. He's going to suffer. And so Jesus says in Matthew alone, on this rock I'm going to build my church. And the point that he's making is, with Messiah as the base, I can talk about who I really am. If you understand that I'm one of a kind and not a dime a dozen, you can understand who I am. But I've got to tell you who I really am. And who I really am is not just a powerful delivering figure, although that's part of what the Messiah is going to be. I'm also going to suffer. And the Son of Man's going to suffer. And when he starts to talk about that, the disciples go, no, that can't work. Peter takes him aside and says, no, that's not the Messiah. And Jesus says to Peter, not exactly a compliment, get behind me, Satan. Criterion of embarrassment. You wouldn't say that to your top leader and make that public unless it really happened. And so we think this all happened, and this is all a chain of events that we can substantiate. So Jesus says he's one of a kind. He's the Messiah. In contrast to the prophets, that's the core of what's happening in Caesarea Philippi.
So O'Reilly would be right in saying that the majority of people, when they heard that word, they would think of the all-powerful figure.
That's
and
right.
Jesus is the one that is saying there's more to it than that.
That's right, and it's more complicated than you think, and it really takes Jesus the entire journey from that point of the confession all the way to the time he gets to Jerusalem to drive home the fact that he's going to suffer. Even when he's at the Last Supper, he's driving home the point that he's going to suffer, and they're struggling with it, so much so that when he's crucified, they think it's over. And in fact, they don't discover otherwise until they discover the empty tomb.
All right, and Gary, let's go back to now Jesus is taken by the religious leaders in Mark 14, and he's brought in before the Sanhedrin, and the fact is they start asking him questions. They're hunting for a reason, a crime that they can accuse him of and put him to death, and they've got to then take that claim, that crime, and he got to sell it to Pilate over here. And they asked him the question, under oath, are you the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, Son of God. And Jesus said, I am. And then he says, you shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of glory, sitting at the right hand of God. So what does all of that mean? Now, he's got Messiah in there, but he's also got it with some other things.
Yeah, one thing to put it in a little bit of context, I think it's important to see that at that point in the interrogation, just previously, a number of witnesses had come. And the text says they were false witnesses, they were making things up, their stories weren't hanging together well. And of course, the most prominent thing there is he said if you pull down the temple, he'll build it up in 3 days. But nothing's sticking. And I think of it as the high priest is saying, all right, we're not doing a really good job yet. We're not really brought this argument together. And it's almost like he steps up to Jesus and he goes, you guys get out of here. We've got enough witnesses. It's me and you. Mano a mano, okay? I'm just going to get this straight. I'm tired of this other stuff, riffraff. Here it is. Are you the Christ? Read my lips. The Son of the Blessed One. And he says, ego me. Now, maybe he's sitting there thinking, maybe Caiaphas is sitting there thinking, we could go in different directions with this, but I've really got to, I've got him on the run here. I've really got, it's a little debate, and I'm beating this guy. These other guys lost. I'm getting in there. And Jesus just goes on and volunteers. Yes, I'm the Christ. Yes, I'm the Messiah. Yes, I'm the Son of the Blessed One. And henceforth you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds and seated at the right hand of God. So I think Caiaphas gets more than what he wants. It's like, well, all right, leave it to me. All you guys leave. I got him cornered here. And Jesus just walks into the trap. And Caiaphas thinks he's got him.
Why did he think he got him?
Well, I think the blasphemy means not just we got what we want here, but I think it's back to, this is the way I look at it. This mano a mano thing, right here, I got him. I got him. You guys go out in the countryside and you keep getting slaughtered by him. That's why I'm the high priest, and you're not. We're going to solve this deal right here. It's like walking off the set after a debate or something. You know, it's like, okay, it's over. I think he thought he had him treed, so to speak. He had him cornered. He got everything he wanted. Ego and me to Messiah and Son of God. But as Jesus unpacks it, Son of Man, coming on the clouds, which is used only of God or the gods, and it means coming to judgment, too, we should add. A little bit offensive. But especially, most commentators, I think, Darrell among them, most commentators seem to think that the key comment there is seated on the right hand of God. That does not have the ambiguity that some of the rest of them have. Because in 1 Enoch, seated on the right hand of God comes right directly after that is they worshiped him.
Darrell?
It's very, very important that they get this right. They're only going to get one case to take to Pilate. If they fail in taking this case to Pilate, then the Romans have exonerated Jesus. So their inability to get that charge on the temple nailed down, they're nervous. The high priest steps in, and when he gets a confession, yes, I am the Messiah, the Son of God, they can translate that charge, even though it's blasphemy to the Jewish leadership, they can translate that charge into political charge that Pilate has to deal with. So the whole sequence makes sense. Here's the other thing that's the curveball in the whole deal. The person whose testimony sent Jesus to the cross is Jesus. That's how committed he was to going to the cross. That's how committed he was to his death. We wouldn't have gotten there without Jesus speaking up and saying, I am.
But with those verses where he said, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to be killed, he also always included, and I will rise again on the third day.
And it says the disciples never got that part.
Never
got that far.
And we're going to talk about that as we go along here. But we've got Jesus did claim to be the Son of God. Jesus did claim to be the Messiah. But I want to look at the next question. It's in Bill O'Reilly's book. Did Jesus actually perform supernatural miracles while he was living? And how do critical scholars look at the supernatural? How do you interpret the evidence? So, folks, that's what we're going to talk about next week. I hope you'll join us. Welcome to our program. We got a great one for you today. Have you read Bill O'Reilly's latest book, Killing Jesus? You've probably heard of people talking about it. Well, we have two of the world's leading New Testament scholars that are here critiquing Bill O'Reilly's book. And it's interesting that he cites them in the end of his book as scholars that we should read their books. And today our topic is going to be about, did Jesus and do historical Jesus scholars actually believe that while he walked this earth that he was performing supernatural miracles? All right? In parts of his book, you'll notice that Bill O'Reilly does not talk about the miracles that are recorded in the four Gospels. Concerning Nicodemus would be one example. We know that you're sent from God because nobody could do these miracles except a man who is sent by God. He leaves out that nobody can do these miracles except one sent by God. Why did he leave it out? Or they are touched on lightly, or sometimes they're even referred to as legend. So when he talks about Lazarus rising from the dead or being brought back from the dead by Jesus, that's a legend. Or sometimes he seems surprised that they actually happen, that the Pharisees actually saw a man with a withered hand healed. He has to do something with that. Now, he talks about this at the end of his book, what he and his co-writer faced. He says, both Martin Dugard and I learned a tremendous amount while researching and writing this book. But one intriguing question. First, why did thousands of common people seek out Jesus of Nazareth? Most couldn't even hear him preach because the crowds were so vast. So why did they come? What was Jesus doing that prompted so many people to set aside their daily labor to be near him? Christians attribute Jesus' popularity to his message of love, hope, and truth, but also to his miraculous healings. Now he says Christians attribute this, but even non-believers must admit that something extraordinary was happening in Galilee. So, to me, he's walking the fence here, and I can kind of understand it in some ways why he's doing this. But let's talk about you as critical scholars here, looking at this. How do you marshal evidence, and how does scholarship as a whole marshal evidence to say, yeah, supernatural miracles actually did take place, or they didn't? How do you get to answer that question?
There really are two steps. The first is that the textual evidence is loaded with the fact that these claims are associated with Jesus. They're in every strand of the tradition. So you don't miss it. There's no missing this. It's everywhere in the gospel tradition. We're talking about Mark, Q, M, L, John, all the source levels at the biblical level. They're alluded to in the context of the rest of the New Testament. And then, besides that, we have sources outside the Bible coming from enemies who also make the case. So we know Jesus and the miraculous were associated with one another. Now that's level one. The level of the data is it's there. The second level is, how do you assess that? That's where worldview comes in. It all depends with the glasses you put on and read the material. If you think this is something that God is capable of doing, you're going to take this seriously. But if you have trouble with the idea of miracles conceptually, philosophically, emotionally, whatever, then you're going to work to explain it in some way. It's there, so you got to explain it. How are you going to explain it? And that's where you watch everybody kind of fall out in different places. So I suspect that the reason you're getting care here is that O'Reilly realizes that if you buy in on the miracles, you've bought into the deal. If miracles happen, the resurrection becomes possible. There's no reason not to believe some of the things that draw people to Jesus, that show who he is. It's a core part of the deal. And so if you buy in, you've signed on. And
let me talk to Gary. You're the philosopher here, okay? In terms of putting what Daryl said, these glasses on, the worldview, what should head a person one way or another? We're talking about probability here. What are some of the things outside that should influence a person's worldview to either open the door or shut the door?
Oh, extremely important. In fact, I think we're conflating things here all into a nice package, and it's really at least two major questions. For example, in John chapter 12, the people standing around Jesus hear a voice from heaven, and we say that we see some of them say, I think I just heard some thunder. Should we be looking for cover? And someone else says, I think an angel spoke to him. And someone else says, maybe it was God. Now, that's a great passage as far as worldview differences. People maybe didn't hear the same thing, but the same thing at the same time they thought different things from this. Now, what we conflate is we frequently think in the West that here's how you get a miracle. You get a lot of evidence. And if you really want to be sure it's a miracle, you get more evidence. And if you want more evidence, if you get really, you're asking good questions, let's give more evidence. Really, there's two questions. One is, do we have data? Do we have evidence? That's what we've done most of our talking about here. But the second question is this. A miracle, by definition, requires God to have performed something. If there's no supernatural intervention, or if there's no supernatural action, there's no miracle, no matter how odd or no matter how good the evidence. So philosophers look for what they sometimes call a divine action pattern. It's not just events. It's things surrounding the event that cohere, that say, this is more than a weird set of circumstances. Now, if you get the data, you have weird set of circumstances. Without the data, you don't have weird circumstances. But if you do, now you say, what's the whole package here? And you think, wait a minute. Jesus brought a lot more to the table here than just these events. How do people call these miracles? Well, they may not have thought through it philosophically, but they're hearing this person say some incredible things about themselves. We've talked about Messiah, Son of God, Son of Man. He can forgive sins. He does all, he refers to God in personal terms. We have all these checks and balances. But also, who's this person, Jesus? We don't have any other founder of a major belief system whose miracles are reported very early. We have all this in Jesus, but with Jesus we also have, from what we can tell, a sinless life. I mean, he's without guile. He's not, he's, some people said, Bill O'Reilly says, fulfilling all these Old Testament things. So if you have a guy who lives a good life, who looks like he's the Messiah of the Old Testament, who's doing miracles, and saying these things about himself, that's a whole package. That's a divine action pattern. So I think what equals miracle is event plus action pattern equals God's hand must be on him. And so you could say, I think the Jewish leaders made the right move. They went, divine action pattern. It's called Satan. And so now all you have to solve is the difference between God's hand and Satan's hand. But they knew what they were doing, that you have a person, a message, and events here. We better stop this train because it's going down the track, and he's got more than just events here.
Let me take a book like The Zealot and throw that into the mix here, because The Zealot says you had miracle workers that were a dime a dozen. And a lot of critical scholars said, hey, the place was flooded with people that were so-called miracle workers. We got Jewish, we got Greek, we got all of these things that influenced people to write stories about Jesus that showed that he was, like those guys, he was supernatural, okay? You're saying not necessarily true.
Yeah, we do have examples of other claimants of miracles, but usually they're the resume is pretty sparse. Vespasian is associated with a couple of miracles that supposedly undergirds the fact that he deserves to be emperor, that kind of a thing. You do get more comprehensive resumes from Jewish people like Honi the circle drawer and Hanina Mendoza, or Apollonius of Tyana, a Greco-Roman figure. But these operate differently. They mediate what they do. It's actually the God who does the healing. They don't. They pray for it or they use a formula. In the case of Apollonius, is the closest example. He has a wide resume, but the work that's written about him is written almost 2 centuries after the time of the events. And it's commissioned by someone who's an anti-Christian. And so all that goes together to undercut what's going on there. What makes Jesus unique is he is what's called a bearer of numinous power. He makes his claims directly. That's unlike what you see in the Jewish parallels, and it's unlike most of what you see in the Greco-Roman parallels.
Yeah, he doesn't have to draw a circle around himself, then pray for something to happen, or say an incantation, or do something else.
Exactly right.
He just does
he does it directly. And so this is a very different kind of approach. A technical work by Eric Evie called The Context of Jesus, the Jewish Context of Jesus' Miracles, makes this point. And emphasizes it. So there's something going on there. So Jesus, yes, there are other miracle workers, other miracle worker claimants, but the quality of the miracles, the scope of the miracles, and the way in which they're done, very different.
All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to follow up, and we're going to get down to what are some of the accounts that are in the documents, in the sources, the New Testament documents here, that actually show to critical scholars something did happen. So that O'Reilly is saying, even non-believers have to admit something was happening here. Okay? How far can we push some of these stories? We're going to take 4 stories, so stick with us. We'll be right back. All right, we're back. We're talking with 2 of the leading historical Jesus scholars in the world, and we're talking about Bill O'Reilly's new book, Killing Jesus. And we're asking the interesting question, is there real evidence that Jesus, while he was living, performed supernatural miracles? What do critical scholars lean on to answer that question? This may be helping Bill O'Reilly's case coming up here in the future. How do you guys go after this? Let's take some of the actual accounts that you think are very credible and push people in the direction of saying, Jesus, yeah, he really did something supernatural here.
Well, I think the important place to start is to, again, remind people that we have testimony all over the place that Jesus is doing unusual stuff, that we don't have the on the table, didn't happen. That actually is a product of our own modern, very confined Western worldview. I need to mention this, that Craig Keener's written 2 volumes in a work called Miracles, 2 very large books in which he documents the evidence for miracles that exist around the world today. And the point that he's trying to make is that the reaction against miracles is actually a Western post-Enlightenment worldview point of view that has shut out the possibility of accepting miracles, but most of the world doesn't accept it, even today. So I think that's an important point to make as we're thinking about what kind of glasses are we going to put on, what kind of lenses are we going to have.
Yeah, we just got done with a series where we had fellows talking about how Jesus is showing up and appearing to Muslim people in different countries across the world. So like 1 out of 3 folks that are coming out of Islam are as a result of Jesus actually coming and appearing to them. So
yeah, and that's not the internet. So
no.
there's something going on there.
No.
So that's the first place to start. Well, in light of that, then you look at the kind of resume or CV that Jesus puts forward in the Gospels by the activity that he does. And probably no passage encapsulates that or summarizes it more succinctly than a series of 4 miracles that take place in Mark and in Luke. They're in Mark 5, I believe, and Luke 8. And what you get are 4 miracles in a row. You get the calming of the storm. We've already talked about it. Who can command the wind and the waves, and they obey him. That's miracle number 1. That deals with the dominion. Then you got demons. You get the Gerasene demoniac, and Jesus cleanses the man of the multitude of demons. That's the second one. Then you've got the healing of the flow of blood of the woman who touches on the edge of Jesus' garment while he's walking to raise Jairus' daughter from the dead. And he stops and engages her and heals her of the flow of blood. And then last, you've got the raising of Jairus' daughter. So you get dominion or creation, you get demons, you get disease, you get death. You come in from the outside in. Creation from the outside, demons attacking on the inside, disease that eats us up from the inside, finally death that gets us. Jesus conquers it all. And so it's an A to Z look at Jesus' miracles and his power. It obviously made a deep impression on the gospel writers, and they present it as kind of a summation of what Jesus is about. And it's one of those things that draws the disciples to figure out, we aren't just hanging out with another guy. This is something special that's going on here.
Gary?
Well, I like the Craig Keener jumping off point too. Craig tries to tell us we have to not be victims of our own prejudice, our own worldview. Craig Keener calls the part of the world that accepts miracles, he calls it the majority worldview. We're the minority worldview.
It's the 2/3 world, technically, if you want to think of it that way.
And if you think, well, that's just because they all live in caves, and no, you're talking about a large part of the technical world that doesn't share our view. And minority doesn't mean right or wrong, but we pride ourselves, we think everybody agrees with us, when actually nobody does. And if you know the right place to look in the West, if all you had were Western miracle accounts, you'd have plenty to establish it just in our view alone. Because we usually tend to sweep things under the, we know these cases too. We just kind of look the other way. So I think we do need to challenge our worldview. And that's that issue I was bringing up earlier. With miracle, you have a lot of good evidence. You need evidence, but you need a worldview change. You need something in between. And with Jesus, you get the whole ball of wax. You get everything.
What's the one story that really stands out to you? The miracle story that stands out to you?
Probably the miracle story. We've already talked about it, but probably the miracle story, besides the resurrection, of course, which really brings it all together.
Which we're going to get to coming up, yeah.
I'd say Mark chapter 2 with the forgiveness of sins, and especially Jesus' words. After he pronounces the man's sins are forgiven, he says, so that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins. I say, take up your bed, arise, take up your bed and walk, so that you may know. And look at everything that's rolled in there to one. He does a miracle, called himself the Son of Man, and says that forgives the man's sins, and says so that you may know that I have the authority to do this. Daryl talked about a string of 4 miracles. Here's one miracle, a different kind of look, one miracle, but with little different parts, like Mark 14, which isn't a miracle, but different kinds of claims. Here's the whole thing rolled into one, and Jesus says, so that you may know I'm doing this. Or John, so that you may have your questions answered. John the Baptist, look at all the things I'm doing. So I think those accounts are most moving to me.
Let me just pick up one here. Bill O'Reilly in his book talks about a very interesting situation where he leaves out the miraculous, and he kind of just highlights the fact Jesus is drawing all people to himself by saying he comes to this village, and a Roman centurion comes to him and proclaims his faith in Jesus. But Bill O'Reilly forgets the whole account of why it seems he did that. You want to tell us about that?
Well, what's interesting about that account is that the centurion doesn't have any sense of entitlement about the healing. He comes and he says, I'm not worthy for you to come into my house. And Jesus, when he hears this, says, I haven't found faith like this in Israel. And the request is, I'm not worthy to have you come under my house. I know what it is to give a command. You say the word and it'll be done. He understands Jesus can do it from a distance. He understands he's not entitled. He understands all Jesus has got to do is say the word and it's done. It's a done deal. He has a deep impression of the extent of Jesus' authority. There's another miracle besides that one that I think is important. It's the healing of the blind man in John 9, because no blind person gets healed in the Old Testament. And the other thing that's important is in the midst of the dispute, this point comes up. God doesn't work with sinners. So if this blind man gets healed, how is it that this person can be healed? He's performing an act on the Sabbath. He's not supposed to be laboring on the Sabbath, so he's theoretically violating the Sabbath in the view of some. He's healing a blind man in the view of others, and God doesn't work with sinners, and yet here's this guy who's been blind from birth. Now he can see. So it's kind of, you make the call. What just happened? And so we get these events that push people to see that the signs are authentications. Not just of Jesus' act to heal and his ability to heal, but authentications of his claims, authentications of his person, just like the resurrection will be.
Daryl, all three of us have listened to this kind of evidence, and you're just drawn to Jesus. And the question is, would Jesus do any kind of business with me? Would he have a relationship with me? Because all of the sins of my life, people may be listening right now and saying, I got all these sins, and would Jesus have anything to do with me? Is it possible for me to have a relationship with him? Would he want that? What was his mission?
Well, the answer is he cleanses, he allows people to see, he allows the deaf to hear, he changes life.
He came to seek and to save those which are lost.
And he changes lives. He changes the direction of lives. The woman with the flow of blood can't operate in society. The leper can't operate in society. The paralytic can't do anything. As a result of his actions, he brings them back into life and into the world. All those are pictures. They're metaphors. They're real events, but they picture something more important. They're PowerPoints that show that Jesus came to bring us back into real life, in a real connection with the living God, so that we can live life the way God designed it to be lived originally.
By the way, using the same principle of embarrassment, Jesus also did it with the most despised members of society. So nobody could say in Jesus' day, well, he won't talk to me because I'm really far outside of this group. Jesus went to the ones who were the furthest outside, the most outcast, whether it was the tax collectors or the wealthy or the Jewish leaders, but he also went to the lepers and people who you couldn't have contact with. Nothing was too hard for him, and nobody was too far outside of his circle.
Yeah. All of this is just solid evidence of why we believe in Jesus, and it also helps Bill O'Reilly's case that he's making in his book that Jesus was a miracle worker, that he did perform supernatural miracles. Now, we're going to get to the big one in the next 2 weeks. And why did people in Jerusalem and across the Roman Empire believe in Jesus after he was shamefully crucified, dead, and buried? Why do you want to believe in that kind of a person? That is a key question, one that Bill O'Reilly says is the core coming up here of the Christian faith. And we want to look at the evidence for that, and I hope that you'll join us then. Welcome to our program. We got a great one for you today. We're talking about Bill O'Reilly's book, Killing Jesus, and I have two of the leading New Testament scholars in the world who are critiquing it. Bill O'Reilly himself recommends their books to us to read. Today we're going to talk about one of the key topics in his book. Why did people in Jerusalem and across the Roman Empire believe in Jesus after he was shamefully crucified? He died and he was buried. Okay? Very interesting question. My guests are Dr. Darrell Bach, one of the leading historical Jesus scholars in our country and one of the world's foremost authorities on the Gospel of Luke. He's a senior research professor of New Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary. And Dr. Gary Habermas, the distinguished research professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy and Theology at Liberty University, who has authored, or edited more than 60 books. And guys, we're glad that you're here. And Gary, let me start with you on this one. He's talking about the events that take place from the time Jesus is crucified and what happened afterwards. And we're going to the big question of what happened to Jesus' body? Because he says the tomb was found empty on the third day. Okay? And so now we get into, you've got to answer the question, if Jesus was actually shamefully crucified, dead and buried, it didn't matter what he said. If that's all that happened to him, then why are we talking about him? Why are 2 billion people in the world following him? And so he's going to take us through these events, and I want to look at what he says through the eyes of critical scholars like yourself, and I want you to comment on it. Are we building the case or are we destroying the case? Are we answering the question, finally, what happened to Jesus' body? All right? He starts off on page 253. His soldiers now go about the hard physical labor of uncrucifying a man. A Sadducee named Joseph of Arimathea steps forth. So what he's saying is, Jesus is crucified. Now they got to take him down from the cross. So they're uncrucifying him. They got to get the nails out and all this kind of stuff. So they're uncrucifying him. And two guys are going to stand there. Joseph of Arimathea, and then you've got Nicodemus, the Pharisee, both members of the Sanhedrin. All right? Now, what is the significance, first of all, of Jesus dying and then of these fellows starting to show up in the story?
Well, the death of Jesus, the significance hits us at a bunch of different levels. For example, we've talked several times about nobody expected that death in the first place. Secondly, if they had, I'm not sure why they would have, because they were so shocked by Jesus' comment. But if they had, they've got this horrible problem that Paul refers to later. Deuteronomy says, "Cursed is the man who hangs on a tree." So if you were to allow it, then you got the argument that he's cursed. So if he's cursed, how could he ever be God's Messiah, Son of God, Son of Man that we've been talking about? So maybe that's one reason why they're so, slow about accepting this. Then you've got medical questions too. All right, so what's his crucifixion? What did they do to him? How bad a shape was he before they crucified him? How do we know he died? We have to make sure he was dead when they put him in the grave. And then you start going to the next subject, which is how do they bury him? So.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why I just want to bring up in passing the point that he actually died,
right,
is there's been so many books that have speculated, he didn't really die. Yeah, he was crucified, but he really didn't die. Yeah. He resuscitated somehow, the tomb got out, showed himself to the disciples. That's why I thought he resurrected.
Right.
What do you say about that?
Well, my comment is virtually every book. Show me a book that says Jesus did die on the cross. And one thing, there are a few exceptions, but very, very, very few. Before you even turn it over and say, who's the author and what are their credentials, you know the person is not a specialist in the field. You know they either are not scholars, or if they are, they work in other areas. And one thing about critical literature the real critical literature, the what if Jesus existed literature that people like Bart Ehrman go after and just say, you guys aren't even prepared, you're not equipped to answer these questions. One thing is, they will take almost any specialization. It's an American diplomat, it's a person who's got only a bachelor's degree, but all of a sudden they're an authority if they're saying what I want to say. So we're back to the worldview things. That's the sorts of folks, to be honest, that write the kind of books, or Muslims, that's a growing group. Those are the two kinds of groups that try to say Jesus did die on the cross.
Yeah, and O'Reilly comes up 254. You can see where this influence comes in. They wrap the body tightly in linen and making sure to keep it loose around Jesus' face in case he's not really dead.
Yeah, and I don't have any idea where that came from, but as soon as I saw it, I went, whoa, and I put 2 question marks out in the margin. Maybe, just a hint. In the book of Mark, we've got Pilate. The old King James is kind of cool. He marveled that he was so soon dead, and he calls a centurion in all the way from the field to say, you sure this guy's dead? You sure? All right, you guys can have him. Now, I have several questions there. Was he that concerned? And so he gives the body away. Secondly, is the centurion the best we have? We don't have a guy out there with an EEG and an EKG out in the mountain. How do we know he was dead? Now, we have to go through that same question. But maybe because Pilate raises the question, Bill O'Reilly thought, I don't know. I don't know why he has that phrase. But you notice like a sentence later,
I'll read it for you. All this is merely adherence to ritual, for Jesus is clearly dead.
Yep.
The spear rupturing the pericardial sac around his heart left no doubt.
Correct. Because Bill O'Reilly puts 2 theories together, both kind of prominent. One is the pleural effusion, which is the fluid buildup around the lungs that can eventually cause asphyxiation. And the other one is around the heart is a sac called the pericardium. It's a very thin sac with a watery liquid inside, and it's virtually impossible to stab with the spear now, to stab the pericardium and not go through the heart because of how thin it is. But inside the pericardium is a watery substance, so we have to answer this water question. And I'll just add in passing, outside the New Testament, we do have several references to death blows to the people on crosses to make sure they don't get down alive, and piercing the body is mentioned in at least 2 different sources, one non-Christian, one Christian. So we do have secular sources for doing things to people crucified, including stabbing them to make sure they don't get down.
Darrell, he goes on, O'Reilly says on page 257, Caiaphas tells Pilate directly, that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise again, so give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Now, I don't think that O'Reilly's aware that most scholars don't believe that there was a guard there. Is that correct?
That's right, because again, it's a singly attested piece of material from Matthew, so you don't get corroboration. Now, I need to say that one of the things about the criteria that makes it tricky is because something doesn't meet the criteria doesn't mean something doesn't happen. It simply means you can't show that it's happened.
Or that it's not true.
That's right.
We believe they actually were there.
That's right.
It's just you're saying that if you're taking from a critical point of view, you don't have substantiating documentation.
Yeah, imagine you're in a court of law and you want to bring forward a witness to make the case to the court that X happened. If you don't have witnesses, you can't establish that X happened. That's what you're dealing with. So when we say something doesn't have corroboration by the criteria, we say we can't verify the fact that it takes place. We either have to trust the source that it happened or we dismiss it.
Yeah, it's interesting that Joseph of Arimathea, coming back to those 2 guys, and Nicodemus are both named. And the tomb where Jesus is buried is named. So they all knew that. What's the significance of that?
Well, it's significant because for a number of reasons. Again, these are not very well-known people. It's not like you want to brag about them and say, well, the guy who owned this tomb is, and name some very prominent person. They're not very well known. That's kind of obscure. That argues in its favor. But it's also important that we know where the body was laid. If we're going to claim later that the tomb was empty, you have to know that there is a tomb. And so you've got to know, what it is we're looking for. And how do you know people knew where it was? How did John Dominic Crossan has a very well-known line. Of course, he believes Jesus was buried in just a common grave. But he says, the people who knew didn't care, and the people who cared didn't know. that catchy little line. So for us, the question would be, how do we know the people that needed to know were the ones that know? Did they know where the location of the tomb was? And I think we're covered on all these things.
All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about what O'Reilly says on page 261. He says, what comes next is the very root of the Christian faith. We're going to find out what he thinks that is, and if you guys agree, we'll talk about it when we come right back. Stick with us. All right, we're back. We're talking about Bill O'Reilly's new book, Killing Jesus, with two of the leading historical Jesus scholars in the world. We've got Dr. Darrell Bock and Dr. Gary Habermas, and we're talking about this whole thing of why would Jesus' message have spread across the entire Roman Empire within 300-400 years, and why is it that 2 billion people today believe him if the end of the story was Jesus is crucified, dead, and buried? All right? What do you think here?
Well, you know, people who doubt the resurrection argue that it's the early church making up the resurrection rather than it having been a real event. But just think about it. I like to tell my students, imagine you're the PR firm hired to resurrect the Jesus movement that's now dead and buried. And you have your pre-meeting and you say, the way we're going to do this is we're going to make up a story. We're going to sell a difficult idea, resurrection. Not everyone believes in it. And the way we're going to start off that story is our first witnesses are going to be women. And that's going to be convincing. Well, of course, women in the culture don't count as witnesses like men do. The tradition in Judaism is that women can testify in certain court situations, usually involving sexual abuse and things like that, but they don't generally count as witnesses. So your first witnesses are going to be women. Well, you strike off and say, you wouldn't have done the story that way. Or another one is, some critics say, well, Jesus really didn't present himself as Messiah, he presented himself as a prophet. So now you're going to use a difficult idea to sell the idea that Jesus is the Messiah, and there's no precedent in Judaism for a Messiah being crucified and resurrected, so you're building it around a premise and a precedent that doesn't even exist, so you're not going to do it that way. Or the third claim is, well, the reason you get resurrection stories built around prominent people is because the people who are prominent, who are at the center of the story, help to bring credibility to the event. But here's what we don't have. We don't have a single event that focuses around the resurrection appearance to James, even though we know it happened. And we don't have a single event built around a resurrection appearance to Peter alone, even though we know that happened. Well, if you were going to present the key witnesses to Jesus and you can fabricate it however you want, why don't we get those stories? So if you take the alternative hypothesis, there's no way to get there. So something must have happened that was the resurrection that caused the church to proclaim and believe in resurrection.
Yeah, or another way of saying it, Gary, is that the reason they put the women in there is because that's the way it happened.
Right, exactly. Because you've got four Gospels, and we often think these were four guys up and down the street. You know, they knew each other, they went to church together. These guys are in different parts of the Roman Empire, and all four of them are going to start their story with women. You go, well, they copied off each other. Scholars agree that they're kind of on their own here. Now, there's a difference of opinion about how many different sources there are, but out of the four Gospels, they are kind of writing independently here. And how do you make all four of them say it was the women?
Yeah, I think some people turn that around and use it against you and say, therefore, it isn't credible because we have different numbers of people being reported to come to the tomb.
Well, yeah, except that's an example where I say to them, you know, the first rule of literary criticism is don't criticize an author for not doing something they clearly told you they didn't intend to do, right? In 3 of the 4 Gospels, we're told that they were not trying to give an exhaustive list of the number of women who come. For example, in Luke, you say, well, right here's the number of women. It's Mary, Mary, and Joanna. And Luke, really? Where do you get that? Well, it's right here. They went to the empty tomb. There's no names there. Oh, no. You got to go all the way down to verse 10. And in verse 10, it says, Mary, Mary, Joanna, and the other women with them. What does that mean? That means there were some others, and I'm not going to give you their names. Now, Mark has a similar comment. And John only has Mary Magdalene, but in John 20, verse 2, it says we, implying some others know what she's talking about at least. So their point is not to be exhaustive, and then we try to say, well, she's mentioning Joanna. Joanna's not mentioned anywhere else. Well, what does other women mean? So I just think that's if that's the best you can do, that's a pretty weak argument.
O'Reilly says this: what comes next is the very root of the Christian faith. The Gospels record that Jesus' body was not stolen. Indeed, Scripture puts forth that Jesus rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. After his body was found missing, the Gospels state that Jesus appeared 12 times on earth over a 40-day period of time. These apparitions range from a single individual to groups of more than 500 on a mountain in Galilee. Some people say this is where they really made up the story. All of these people that said they saw Jesus. What do you say to that?
Well, I think what you're going to have to do right away is our earliest list of appearances is Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now, I won't be able to give the whole argument here, but you can get that sequence. Where did Paul receive this? 1 Corinthians 15:3, he said, I gave you what I was given. Critics, in fact, Richard Bauckham of Cambridge lists this as the consensus New Testament position. That is that Paul received this material about 35 AD, which is +5 after the cross, and he had to get it from others, so that shortens the date. Bart Ehrman, of all people, say that this date goes back to 1 to 2 years after the cross, and not just 1 Corinthians 15, several sermon summaries in the book of Acts. He dates 1 to 2 years after the cross. So that's pretty early. And in that list, you have 3 groups of individuals. That counts Paul's appending his own name to the end. So 3 individuals, 3 groups. You've got a group called the 12, a group called all the apostles, a group called the 500 at one time. So from the earliest, which goes back basically to the cross, we have a list of group appearances. So if you want to do away with this, you're going to have to deal with the text. So that's where we're at our best.
So we're saying, Darrell, that you basically have eyewitnesses, and you've got evidence for these eyewitnesses, whether you know how to deal with it or not.
Yeah, and what's significant here is it's not just individual appearances, it's group appearances, appearing to people at the same time, a kind of corporate appearance, if you will.
Yeah, because you don't have group hallucinations.
That's exactly right, because what some people want to say is, well, they had individual visions or some sense that Jesus was alive at an individual level, something like that, but these group appearances prevent you from going there.
Yeah, I mean, you got a great illustration that if you and your wife are dreaming, you're not dreaming the same dream.
That's correct. In fact, I just read an account recently of a guy who tries to argue for group hallucinations. And what he argues for is a bunch of people standing in one place all have separate hallucinations. Every time you do that, you decrease the odds you increase the odds against, because that's not even likely to have 2 hallucinations in the same room. They're fairly rare. To have everybody have one simultaneously is, but they're different hallucinations. That's just extraordinary. Like I said, 2 people say it was a great dream we had last night. We don't share those things.
Yeah, all right, so let's get down to the crunch here of this, is that O'Reilly is saying the root of the Christian faith is that something happened here. The Christian faith says Jesus rose from the dead. What I'm asking you, what is the strongest evidence to say that happened?
The strongest evidence to say that Jesus appeared, I think, is to take the group appearances that can go back to the cross, that go all the way back, with eyewitnesses. And I think the key to the eyewitnesses, he and I may disagree on this, but I'm saying the best way to go after the eyewitnesses is not to try to prove that the Gospels are written by eyewitnesses necessarily, but to argue that Paul was in the right place at the right time, knew the eyewitnesses. Paul goes to Jerusalem at about +5, goes back before 50 AD, he's there twice. In both cases, he's interviewing the eyewitnesses as to the nature of the gospel. The nature of the gospel necessitates the resurrection. So I think Paul's best evidence that he gives in this case is not just his testimony, but I think the best thing Paul does is to repeat the testimony of Peter and James in Galatians 1, and Peter, James, and John, the big 4. Nobody's more influential than Paul, Peter, James, John. He gives the testimony of all of them in Galatians 2, and he says, I set before them the gospel I was preaching, and in English, 5 words, they added nothing to me. Just like he says in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, whether it's I or they, so we preach and so you believe. So he says, we're all on the same page. I don't care who you ask. Go to Peter if you want, go to James, go to John, or I'll tell you, we're all preaching the same message. I think that right there, the earliest time with the people who were there who died as martyrs, those 4, we have first century reports of the martyrdom of 3 of the 4, and a second century report of the last one. John, I think that's the strongest single argument. It's got several orbs, but I think that's the strongest single argument for the resurrection appearances.
Daryl, with about 30 seconds left, why should anybody believe this message today?
Because if Jesus is alive, he's alive. If God raised him from the dead, he's been brought alive from the dead then, and he's still alive now. That's the point. The vindication claim that he made is that God would raise me and place me at his right hand, and you can still be in touch with the living God through what it is that I've provided, and I can provide it because I'm right here at his side. So the picture is that there is a message, an eternal message from an eternal God through an eternal deliverance that comes from an eternal figure so that you can experience eternity.
Folks, this is great stuff, just great stuff. I hope that you're absorbing this and get the tapes of these programs, but we got one more program left, and we're going to come back to this thing, what happened to the body. And Gary's got a very interesting way of attacking this, and that is that there are, if you take all the critical scholars, there are 12 historical facts that they'll all give you. Whether they're Christian or non-Christian, they'll say these basically happen. And he's going to pare those down to 5 or 6. And he's going to say you can just take these and make a convincing case to a skeptic of why Jesus is alive. He rose from the dead. All right, I hope that you'll join us next week. Welcome to our program. We're talking about Bill O'Reilly's new book, Killing Jesus. Have you read it yet? I'm sure you've heard about it. We're going to be examining one of the key topics, namely after Jesus was crucified, dead, and buried, what happened to his body? Why was his tomb found empty 3 days later? And I've got two of the world's leading Jesus scholars here with us today. First, Dr. Darrell Bock, one of the leading historical Jesus scholars in our country and one of the world's foremost authorities on the Gospel of Luke. He's senior research professor of New Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary. And Dr. Gary Habermas, the distinguished research professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy and Theology at Liberty University. He's authored, co-authored, or edited more than 60 books. Now, Gary, you have taken a very interesting approach to answering this question for skeptics, namely, what happened to the body? And you're saying that you can start with a list of 12 historical facts that are accepted by virtually all critical scholars, not just Christians, but guys that are atheists, skeptics, the whole shooting match. You've got 3,400 sources that you are watching, you are checking, you are seeing what they're saying. Tell me this about the 12 historical facts.
Well, I started out very skeptical myself, so I did this for myself. Can we get a resurrection with the lowest common denominator?
Yeah, because you were at Michigan State and you weren't a Christian and
I used to argue with Christians. Okay, well, here's what I did. I took a common list of data that were admitted by scholars. Well, let's say there's 20 or 25. And I thought to myself, well, can I do it with half that? Can I do it with only 12? And then I thought, well, I already arbitrarily cut the list to 12. Nobody only gives you 12. I'll go down to 5 or 6 to show that with a minimal number of facts, and I chose ones that are multiply evidenced by several, coming in like this, many evidences on each fact. And secondly, the vast majority of scholars accepts every one. So I think you can use those 5 and get to the resurrection.
All right, but let me give the list of 12, and then I'll let you pare it down. And you say with just the 5, you can prove that Jesus actually rose from the dead. So let's try it out. First of all, the first fact, Jesus died by crucifixion. Second, he was buried. Third, his death caused the disciples to despair and to lose hope. Fourth, his tomb was found empty on the 3rd day. Fifth, the disciples had experiences that they believed were literal appearances of the risen Jesus. Sixth, because of these experiences, the disciples were transformed from doubters into bold proclaimers of his death and resurrection. Seventh, the message was the center of preaching in the early church. Eighth, this message was especially proclaimed in the environs of Jerusalem, where Jesus had just died and was buried. Ninth, as a result of this preaching, the church came into existence. 10, Sunday became the primary day of worship. 11th, Jesus' own brother James, who had been a skeptic, was converted to the faith because he believed that he had seen the risen Jesus. And 12th, a few years later, Paul was converted by an experience which he likewise believed to be the appearance of the risen Jesus to himself. Now, those are the 12 that you're saying virtually all critical scholars accept, and you're going you're going to cut that in half. What are the ones you've chosen?
Yeah, now I drop out ones like, for example, the empty tomb. I can tell you about 2/3 to 3/4 of scholars accept. That doesn't meet my criteria. So when I get down to 5, I want an acceptance in the 90s of scholarship. I do the second one first. That criterion is not as important, that everybody agrees. But why do they agree? They agree because there's so much evidence at each of these points. And I go anywhere from 4 to 7 that I pick out of the 12. And I emphasize death by crucifixion. The disciples had experiences that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. Their lives were transformed as a result. You have James, you have Paul, and that this was proclaimed very, very early in the church. If I only had to use a half dozen, those are the ones I would go after. And I argue that they are sufficient to both indicate that the resurrection is, you say proof, I would say best explanation for what we know is true. And secondly, you can answer the major naturalistic theories with that data.
All right, take a breath. He's got number 1. Jesus actually died, and you wanted to say something last program. We didn't get it in. Why is it that it's a sure thing that Jesus actually died on that cross?
I think it's important to remember that when Jesus goes up on the cross, he doesn't go up as a pristine body. He's been scourged. The scourging involves a whip with either bone pellets or sherds of glass or whatever, something that cuts the skin. It's designed to cause you to bleed. The reason you bleed is so that you will die more quickly on the cross. They want it to be a particularly gruesome experience. It's so gruesome, Roman citizens were not permitted to be crucified. So the idea that Jesus could go up on the cross, hang there for several hours and survive, that might be a miracle greater than the resurrection itself.
Gary, keep on going.
Well, after that, I would say the next most important thing on the list, if you take the short list, is that the disciples were utterly convinced. They kind of snapped out of their despair and that weekend. And they had experiences which they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. And virtually no scholar writing today is going to deny that. The disciples had experiences, real experiences, that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus, and their lives did 180 degree. Now, I'll say something real briefly. People say, well, in our world today, we've got all kinds of people who die for all kinds of things. It's not true. People die for wrong things all the time. They die for things that are wrong, but that they believe are right. Whenever someone dies for something, we generally say, if they were willing to die for it, they were convinced it was right. And that's what we're trying to get out of this. They had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus, and it turned their lives around because they believed they were right. But the problem is, if you're a critic, it's reported very, very early. There's an empty tomb to kind of back it up a little bit. But these experiences are very, very early. Their lives were changed. You have some skeptics involved, James and Paul and others, but naturalistic theories are so poor at explaining the data that most critics today do not want to be pinned down. You think that's the easiest thing in the world. Well, then you tell me what happened. Pick a naturalistic theory. And I've had guys in dialogue go, oh, no, I know your method. Well, what's my method? You want me to pick a naturalistic theory, then you're going to get me in a corner. I'm going to say, look, if the data are good enough to get you in the corner, no matter what theory you choose, who's that for? Is that a fact on my side or a fact on your side? You're the naturalist, so pick something. And then they'll just go, no, and the crowd starts laughing, and you go, all right, people are starting to see where the data are here.
What was the next one that really came to you?
It's proclaimed very, very early, because even eyewitnesses at 40 years is not the best in the world. These are eyewitnesses immediately on top of the facts with the skeptics that I mentioned a moment ago, James and Paul. I think of Reginald Fuller, a prominent New Testament scholar, who said, even if the New Testament did not say Jesus appeared to James, I have to assume he did, because otherwise I can't explain, one, the man's conversion, and two, his subsequently being elevated to the pastor of the largest church in the ancient world. So somehow we have to explain these life changes.
Yeah, I think, Darrell, that this is very important what Gary's bringing up, is that you have early accounts, and people that are in the critics of the standard Christian position they usually want to take these documents and push them as far back as possible so that you can have a lot of hearsay taking
far
place.
away from the events as
Yeah,
possible.
it's like saying, something at a party and it goes around the circle. They're saying, well, Jesus, he did his thing here, and then it was passed on to this person, and year after year after year, until it was finally 100 years later, it was this guy said it, and this guy, what he wrote, is completely different than from what Jesus did over here. Now, if you have eyewitnesses, if you have early accounts, if you've got sources that go back to the time of Jesus, then all of that goes away. Now, I look at people that, for example, John A.T. Robinson, that actually started the Death of God movement. When he was challenged to look at the documents, he said they were all written, by 70 A.D. Well, whether you believe that or not, that means within 40 years of Jesus' crucifixion, they were all on the newsstands.
Yeah, and it isn't 40 years. If you work your way back to the theology of the early church, what they're preaching and what we know, we can get literally right up against the events themselves. And the key figure here is one of the figures in Gary's core facts, Paul. Paul is converted sometime within a couple of years of the time of Jesus' death. He's been an opponent. He knows what all the debate is. He knows the Jewish side of the argument. He knows the Christian side of the argument. He knows whether the empty tomb is really there. He knows what they're preaching. He knows the whole shooting match. He knows what the Christians are claiming, that Jesus is the Messiah and the promised Son of God. He knows all that. And in the midst of all that, the moment Jesus appears to him, he realized that's a resurrection. If that's a resurrection, then maybe what those guys were saying is true, and he buys in. Now, that conversation that leads to his conversion within a couple of years has been taking place before we get to that conversion. So we're literally right up against the events themselves, in the place where it's happening, in the debate where it's happening. And so there is no gap. That gap has just shrunk. There is no telephone game or Chinese whispers games, whatever you call it. The facts run up right against the events themselves.
Bart Ehrman says two things in his recent book that are just amazing. Now, he's probably, for those who don't know, probably the best-known skeptic in this country. And he says over and over again, don't yell at me. I'm not even a believer. He says that. And yet, he has, in one chapter in his book, Did Jesus Exist?, he's got two arguments that really make a difference. And one of the two is Paul went up to Jerusalem to talk to Peter and James to ascertain the truth of all this. And two of his lines that I just love, one of them says this. He says, Paul spent 15 days with Peter and James. Pause. I'd like to spend 15 days with James and Peter. That's pretty cool. And then he says this. Where do we get closer to eyewitness testimony than this?
Yeah.
That's Bart Ehrman.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Where do we get closer?
All right, we're going to take a break when we come back. I want to slow this down for some of you, and I want to take this passage that we keep referring to in 1 Corinthians 15, the first 3 or 4 verses, and I'm going to quote, I'm going to have Gary quote them, and then we're going to tell you why this is significant to critical scholars. So stick with us. We'll be right back. All right, we're back, and we're talking with Dr. Darrell Bock and Dr. Gary Habermas. We're critiquing Bill O'Reilly's new book, Killing Jesus, that you've probably heard about. And Gary has pared down 12 historical facts that all critical scholars accept down to 5 or 6. And we're talking about those. And we keep on mentioning a passage about what Paul wrote to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 15. I want to put this on the slate for you to see right now. And Darrell, I'm going to ask you to read those verses, then Gary, I'm going to ask you to comment. Why is this considered by critical scholars to be early material? Why did the Jewish scholar Joachim Jeremiah say that this is good stuff, and it takes us right back to the living Jesus, okay?
1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. And it strikes me in reading this that when we think about the story of Jesus, we're not talking about the story of killing Jesus. We're talking about the story of the living Jesus. This is a Jesus who is alive, and his death is not the end of the story.
Absolutely. Gary, why did Joachim Jeremiah say that this is good Jewish tradition and it's early?
Well, first of all, I'll preface it by saying, arguably, it'd be a good question, but arguably, there may be no stronger conclusion from New Testament scholarship than that 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following is an early pre-Pauline creed. It's just assumed by virtually everyone, and very few people give the reasons. But if you did, here's what you'd look at. First of all, Paul is taken in his authentic Pauline epistles to be authoritative, a good scholar, he's honest, etc. And the big reason is Paul himself says, I gave you what I was given. That's simply, I gave you what I was given. We have Paul's word for the fact that he got this from somebody else. Now, in the original text, and Jeremias, by the way, thought that the original text was Aramaic. That's been disputed, but that's one reason. But in the original Greek, it's believed that there are two stanzas, and it doesn't rhyme like English poetry does because English didn't write this. But in the Greek, it reads like this: da 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 da. And there's two stanzas that are divided up with these appearances. And Paul says he got it from somebody else. He's using non-Pauline terms. He's using and hati, and that, and that, and that, which is the Aramaic way of passing on tradition. Matter of fact, Josephus tells us that that's how Pharisees were schooled, by passing on tradition. So this and that tradition moves along. And so that's 3 or 4. That's about half the reasons. But scholars believe that this is pre-Pauline. Now, pre-Pauline means pre-conversion of Paul. If Paul comes to Christ about 1 to 3 years after the cross, depending on who it is you're talking about, and if you put the cross at 30 A.D., Paul comes about 32 right away. You don't have to do any more reasoning. If this is pre-Pauline, it's 30 to 32 A.D., or if you think the crucifixion is 33, it's 33 to 35 A.D. But when Paul goes to Jerusalem in Galatians chapter 1, and he spends 15 days with Peter and James, and if they're confirming this message at that time, the majority of scholars, consensus view, according to Bauckham, is that Paul got this material in Jerusalem when he visits at about 35 A.D. Now, you can out-skeptic the skeptics here, and let's just say for the sake of the argument, Paul didn't get this creed. Okay, right there. Let's just say that comes a little bit later. But Paul is still talking about the nature of the gospel. That's what the whole book of Galatians, that's the only thing the book of Galatians is about.
And what does he say? What does he actually say in that?
In Galatians chapter 1?
No, in 1 Corinthians 15, those verses. What does he actually convey that he received?
Well, Paul says he got the message and he passed it on to the Corinthians when he came, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, was buried, and that he says he died and was buried according to the Scriptures. He said he was raised and appeared. So sometimes people say there's 4 things here: died, buried, rose, appeared. And that this is according to the Scriptures. He repeats twice. And then he gives a list of appearances, 3 to individuals, Peter, James, and Paul.
Jesus appeared to Peter, James, and Paul.
And the 3 groups, all the apostles, the 12 is the first group, and the 500. So that's all there. And that it can be traced back to 35. But 35 was when Paul received it. If 35 was when Paul got it, the guys who gave it to him, Peter and James presumably, they have it before he has it. It takes a while to standardize these da-da-da-da-da-da-da type sayings, and we get back, actually the events are much before that. James D.G. Dunn, as prominent a historical Jesus scholar as there is right now, Dunn says that this stuff had to become standardized within 6 months after the cross. 6 months. Larry Hurtado, Richard Bauckham, they both say it had to be present when the earliest Christian preaching started, the content of this. And then you have, I think that what breaks the camel's back here is Bart Ehrman saying that we can get this material back to 1 to 2 years after the cross. You have to get it before Paul's conversion. So this is early eyewitness material.
Yeah, so they didn't make this up. They got it. It goes right back to Jesus and what happened at that time, and you got the eyewitnesses reporting in, and the people knew all of this stuff. It was tradition being passed on down.
Now, if you think they're wrong, try to come up with a naturalistic theory that answers this. And like I said, most critics, a lot of critics, let's say, they think you're trying to trap them when you say, Pick a naturalistic theory.
In fact, 1 Corinthians 15 is about that very problem, because the whole point of 1 Corinthians 15 is, what if the resurrection didn't happen? He says we're still in our sins and we're the most pitiful of all people. So the very premise that Paul is defending in that statement is Jesus' death for sin and his burial is like his resurrection. They're all historical events we're supposed to take seriously. And because if this doesn't happen, the Christian faith is done. So when O'Reilly says that the resurrection is the root of the Christian faith, he's talking about the historical root. This is the historical root out of which all the theology comes.
Gary, why should a person who's listening to you right now that is not a Christian believe in Jesus as their Lord and Savior? When you were at Michigan State, you were not a Christian. You wrote your PhD thesis on this topic, and you became a Christian. What happened? And give me the reasons why somebody should believe it today.
The resurrection of Jesus is a game changer. It's one of those epical events. Without it, you can reject a lot of things as lies, misbelief. But if there's a resurrection, right away, critics pull away from this, because if Jesus was raised from the dead, that seems to say, without any additional argument, we can give the argument, but without almost any additional argument, it seems to say, if a miracle is a pointer, if it's a sign, and he's raised, that seems to say he's who we thought he was, because dead men don't rise. Now, if you unpack that for just a moment, if he's a man, only a man, and he dies, he's not raising himself. So who's raising him? Well, if he's being acted upon, if his dead body's being acted upon by the God of the universe, guess what? God doesn't act on him to say, and here's the best heretic we've ever known in history. God only raises him from the dead to confirm his message, and that's strictly Jewish. You know, you affirm messages. God doesn't affirm wrong messages. He affirms right messages. And if Jesus is raised by the God of the universe, that immediately puts God's imprimatur, God's blessing, God's seal of approval. As Peter, by the way, preaches in the first Christian sermon, Pentecost, he says he's been shown to be a messenger by his death and resurrection in Acts 2. Right away, the resurrection says God's stamp of approval, approved, approved. So right away, we have data for the belief in Jesus. So, I mean, that's a little bit heady for what most people, but people are saying, why should I do this? Well, I guess the real simple question is, do you want eternal life? Because here's the one who was there, who says you can share it, and you can have your own ideas about what eternal life is or isn't. But if you bypass the only person who's been there, that's not a real smart move if we're trying to figure out, you know, how do I live forever?
Okay, bring it to yourself.
For myself, in 1995, my wife of 23 years had the flu. And it really was the flu, but it didn't go away. And we had to make a couple trips to the hospital, make sure it's not going into her lungs, she's not getting pneumonia. And in one of these checks, someone said, this stuff isn't looking real well. And the local doctors couldn't tell us what was going on, so they sent us up to the University of Virginia, which in our neck of the woods, that's the research hospital. And this is important to me. Is it a biographical note? We went up the day after Easter, 1995. 2 days after Easter, I found out my wife was terminally ill. So here's the resurrection juxtaposed with the worst thing I could ever possibly hear in my life. She's my best friend. I told my closest friends later, the worst possible thing has come upon me. God's good, but the worst possible thing has come upon me. And I was told that day, 2 days after Easter, that she was terminally ill, stage 4, stomach cancer. We got home the first week in May 1995, and just about the first week, August 9th, same year, we buried my wife with stomach cancer. And I realized while her daily progression, I mean, she was a very small stature anyway, but watching her lose half her body weight, and this is the person I love, and it was so incredibly hard. 4 children, they're all home. Youngest is only 9. My wife is only 43. They're asking the same questions. Why mom? Why this? Why now? And I had to go through this and answer some of these things for myself. But I think what was most important to me was realizing that if Jesus is alive, not just in 30 A.D., but in 1995, as Darrell said a few moments ago, he's alive today, well, then resurrection is a timeless message. In fact, it's exactly the message I want. And I still to this day don't know why my wife died, but I pictured the Lord I used to go out and sit on my front porch with a baby monitor next to me because she was sleeping. And I pictured God talking to me and asking me, what kind of a world is this? And I'm saying, well, it's a world where you raised your son from the dead. I said, but I really want to know why Debbie's dying up there. You know, why is she dying? And I think what I pictured him saying to me was, you know something? I know what you're talking about. I watched my son die. And I went, oh, yeah, I've spent my whole life studying this. Yeah, I know he did. He said, now, Gary, I'm not going to tell you why your wife died. But, you know, I answered his prayer. And I'm thinking, I don't want to let this show on my face, but I don't call dying by crucifixion answering your prayer. And the Lord said, yeah, I raised him on Sunday morning. And then I thought, wow, are you telling me my wife has to die? You're telling me she's going to die. And that's how she gets her prayer answered. And to this day, I don't know why she died. But Scripture says twice in Hebrews says the Son of God learned obedience by the things he suffered. So I just started asking, why not me? Why shouldn't I learn obedience by my suffering? And earlier, Hebrews 2, we're told that Jesus was completed through his suffering. Now I would think, you know, am I going to learn faster than Jesus does? Or do I not have to be completed by my suffering, but he had to be? I mean, who do I think I am? And so I realized that suffering is really a part of life. It's part of the gospel. It's an indispensable part of the gospel. And I don't know why the Lord took her, but I cannot think of any doctrine that would be closer to my heart than to say someday we'll be with our loved ones, which is what Paul says many times. John says, Peter, Jesus, many times. I'll end with this. Well, my wife was dying. I got a lot of cards. But the one that really moved me, I could not talk about it for a year after she died. But this card said, what kind of a blessing will it be when you get to heaven and you get to walk hand in hand with your wife? And I thought I was going to die when I read that card. It was just, and I thought, if my faith does that for me, and I have reasons to beat, what's that going to do? And if that's what God's given me, I can wait. I don't know why she's died, but I do know there's a heaven. I do know there's an eternity. I can wait because I'm sure God knows the answer, and he would give it to me. I'd know the answer in 1 minute if he chose to give it. So it's about trusting the Lord in everyday life. That's what it amounts to, because Jesus is living. So that's the point. The resurrection says he's alive today, not just that he was alive back then.
Darrell?
Well, I think what you're hearing about is why Jesus has made a difference for so many people across so many centuries. Not just Gary, but literally thousands of people, different kinds of cultures, different languages, different ethnicities, because he is alive. He lives not just at the side of heaven, but he sends his Spirit to reconnect us with the living God, to produce the reconciliation that is at the core of the gospel. The good news is that you can be reconnected to the living God, and that you, being made in God's image, can be reconnected to that image in fullness through what Jesus Christ has done. It's a pretty good offer. It's worth taking seriously. It's worth embracing because it changes lives. The one who killed Jesus didn't stop him because that Jesus is alive.
That's why I think Christianity is spreading across the world even in our day, because it's true. And folks, I hope that this information will either bring you to the point you say, Jesus, I want you to be my Savior, to forgive my sins. I want to be in relationship with you. Come into my life and change me. And experience it for yourself. And guys, I want to just close by saying thank you for coming and giving this tremendous information. I think people here and across the world are going to say, this is great, great stuff. They have learned a lot. I've learned a lot just in rereading all the books. And so I thank you for all the hours and hours of time that you've put into writing these books and researching these projects.